Ohana. I hope you guys are all having a great week. For those of you stopping by for the first time, hi, aloha, welcome. My name is Kai, and here on this channel, we like to talk about true crime cases that happen in the 808 state. So if you're interested in true crime and Hawaii, I really would love for you to join our Ohana. All you have to do is hit that red subscribe button that you see right there. And don't forget to turn on all your notifications so that you don't miss any uploads. So I don't have a microphone and I'm working on that. I bought a microphone, but then it doesn't work. Yada yada. Anyways, I turned off my AC. Hopefully that will help a little bit with the sound. You might hear some wind chimes in the background, some birds, some dogs, you know. It's nature, right? What can you do about it? Anyways, today's case is a solved homicide case, and it's kind of an older case. I mean, it took place in the 60s on the island of Oahu. And guys, when I found out about this case and when I read about it, I was shook. I mean, and you're gonna find out why, but it's so crazy because this case is almost identical to a case that we have come to know in Texas. But I've never heard about this case before. And the fact that it took place here in Hawaii, my mind was just blown away. This case is so heartbreaking. I mean, like I said, all the cases that I cover on here are heartbreaking, but especially because it involves young children. So for those viewers that are super sensitive to cases involving children, this is your time to click out, and I'll see you in another video. One last thing, guys, before we jump into today's video, I do want to say thank you guys for all you subscribers. I mean, in the last month, so many of you have jumped on and subscribed and supporting the channel. And I totally appreciate you guys. I love you guys so much. I'm so thankful. I'm super excited to see where this journey is going to take us and what amazing things can happen and hopefully happen because of you guys and because of this channel. I do want to give a special shout out to, I think it's Madame Garza, over on TikTok. She's the one that brought a lot of attention to my YouTube channel. There was a lot of comments saying, oh, I found you on TikTok. I'm here from TikTok. And my TikTok account is, let's just say it's not there right now, but that's about to change soon. Anyways, a lot of you were saying, oh, I'm here from TikTok. And I was so confused because I was like, what? TikTok? I have an account, but I'm not even there yet. So super confused. And it wasn't until I typed in Kaiaulanicases, which is the little girl that I had covered her case in one of my videos. I typed in her name into the search bar in TikTok, and that is when I stumbled upon Madame Garza, who actually gave a shout out to me and the video that I covered. So a lot of you were coming over from TikTok. And thank you so much, Madame Garza. I'm sorry, I don't know your real name, but I so appreciate you. Thank you so much for the love and support. Anyways, thank you guys again. I can't say thank you enough. With that being said, guys, let's just start from the very beginning. Maggie Lee Goldman was born on March 24th, 1927 in Aiken County, South Carolina, to parents Claude and Catherine Goldman. Now, Maggie came from a pretty big family. She has a bunch of siblings. Her siblings are Claude, Lucille, Harvey, Robert, Carl, and Charles, and that's not in any order. I'm not sure if there's more siblings. Those are the names of her siblings that I had come across. Now, there's not much in the way of Maggie's childhood, her education, her background, you know, growing up, other than the information I just told you guys. I tried to look high and low, but what you're gonna find about this case is that there's not much background about the people involved in this case. It'll mostly just talk about the day the incident happened and not much more than that. But we do know that Maggie Goldman will end up marrying a man by the name of James Young. Now, there's not a lot of information about James Young. I couldn't find out, where he grew up, his childhood, his education. Again, like I said, there's very little information about the background of the individuals involved. Anyways, moving on. So the couple, they get married and they eventually end up moving to Aiea, which is on the island of Oahu. Now, the reason why they moved to Aiea is because James Young, he was actually an Air Force captain and got stationed at Hickam Air Force Base. Maggie and James would end up having 5 children. I'm not sure if they had some of the children on the mainland and then moved to Aiea, Oahu and had the rest of the children, or I don't know if all of the children were born on the mainland and then they moved to Oahu, or I don't know. It could be that all of the 5 children were born in Oahu, which I highly doubt it. But anyways, the fact is that they end up having 5 children. Now, this took place in the 1960s. Maggie and James, they have a very traditional marriage, a very traditional home setting. And by that, I mean, James is basically the moneymaker, the breadwinner. He's the husband and the father and the man of the house. So he goes out to work. And, he had a really good job. He was an Air Force captain in the military. And Maggie, definitely the traditional wife, mother, homemaker, stays at home with the children, takes care of the children. So that was the setting and that was their relationship. Maggie and James found a cute little house in Aiea, which was located on Nalopaka Place. Just a standard, typical little Hawaii home for a large family. When Maggie and James moved to Oahu, their 5 children were all under the age of 10 years old. So you can imagine that Maggie and James had their hands full. The couple had 4 daughters and 1 boy. The 5 children's names are James Frank Jr., and he was 8 years old. Janice, who is 5 years old. Judith, who is 3 years old. Jeanette, who is 2 years old. And Jessica, who is just 8 months old. Now, just learning that information, I am overwhelmed. Can you imagine having 5 children under the age of 10 years old? And now, back then in the 1960s, they didn't have, childcare. They didn't have all these nanny services. I mean, I'm sure they did, but it's not like how it is today. A lot of families were pretty much traditional, and the moms would stay home with the children, and the dads and husbands would go off to work. I'm not saying all families were traditional. I'm just making a generalization. While James Frank Jr., remember, he's the 8-year-old son, while he's attending school during the day, Maggie is a stay-at-home mom to the other 4 children. Maggie did have 2 older daughters living on Oahu. These daughters were already grown. They're already married off, living in their own households. And they were from Maggie's previous marriage. In early 1965, Maggie's behavior starts to change. She would constantly be tired, and she would often be sleeping during the day and going to bed in her clothing. I couldn't really understand what that meant, but I can assume it meant that she didn't, take a bath and change into her PJs. She just kind of went to bed with her day clothes or whatever she was wearing. James would later say that, quote, her behavior slowly changed until nothing I nor the children did was right, end quote. It got so bad that Maggie became unable to take care of the children. Her adult daughters would have to come over to the house when James left for work and take care of the children, while Maggie would often be tired or asleep or, just in her own zone, and James is at work. Now, after a long day of being at work, James, now the Air Force captain, and now flying jets or airplanes or whatever he was doing on missions, flying is a very taxing job. Senses are on all the time while you're working. You have to be very alert. You can't go flying an airplane tired. Can you imagine that James is at work, okay? He comes home from work after a long day, And by the time James reaches the family home, the two older daughters would have already left and gone to their own homes. And I'm sure they timed it. I'm only assuming. I don't think you would leave 5 children under the age of 10 unattended, but then again, I don't know. James said that when he would come home, Maggie again would be very tired or asleep, and he would often find the children dirty or wet diapers. So James comes home from work, he sees the children like this, he goes into dad mode, husband mode, give them baths, feed them, put them all to bed, and now this is after a long day of work. And I know some of you are watching this video and you're thinking, well, single parents, I'm a single parent, I'm a single mom. You're probably thinking, I'm a single mom, or you might be a single dad, and you're watching this and you're thinking, oh yeah, I do that. I have tons of kids. But you got to remember, and I understand that I'm a single parent and I've done that too, but you got to remember this is back in the 1960s. It was a different era. Maggie began having delusions and hallucinations. On one night, Maggie disappeared from the family home and she was gone for about 3 hours. James didn't know where she went. Her 2 older daughters didn't know where she went. So she finally comes home and she tells her husband that she was at church and she was talking to God. And God told her that her husband is Jesus and her grandmother is the Blessed Mary. A few days after this incident takes place, James is getting ready to go to work and he's about to leave the house. Maggie had a broom in her hand and she takes this broom to James and blocks him and says, quote, "They are out there. They have come to kill me," end quote. At this point, after everything that has happened, James is like, I'm calling out of work. I'm taking the day off. My wife is not well. I need to do something. James takes the day off of work and he tries to have Maggie committed, but he finds out that he can't have his wife committed. Maggie has to voluntarily commit herself to the hospital. So what James does is that he goes out and he seeks help from their priest and from their doctor. Now, with the help of their priest and their doctor, Maggie eventually agrees to be committed. Maggie spends about 2 months at Tripler Army Medical Center. A psychiatrist that is treating Maggie tells James that there's nothing more that the hospital can do for Maggie and that any change needs to come from home. So James has no choice. He has to take Maggie home. In one sense, he feels like, okay, my wife's been here at the hospital. She's been here for 2 months. She's being treated. My prayers are answered. I really wanted Maggie to come home. Maggie is discharged from the hospital and returns home. Now, unfortunately, when Maggie gets home, the young residents will never ever be the same and their lives will forever be changed. November 22nd, 1965, James is away on a flying mission and Maggie is home with the children. Unfortunately, Maggie does the unthinkable. In the morning of November 22nd, 1965, shortly after James Frank Jr., remember the 8-year-old son, after he went off to spend the day at school, Maggie took her 4 young daughters, those 4 precious babies, one by one into the bathtub and drowned them. After Maggie drowned her 4 daughters, she would then go to James Frank Jr. School around 9:30 a.m. in the morning and bring James Frank Jr. home. And once she brought her son home, she then proceeded to take James Frank Jr. into the bathtub and drown him as well. Maggie then placed all the children's bodies, still wet and nude, on twin beds. She had 4 of the girls on one bed, all lined up next to each other. They were all still wet from the water from the bathtub, and they were all still nude. And then she placed James Frank Jr., again, wet, still from the bathtub and nude, on another bed. After Maggie does this horrible, unimaginable, unforgivable acts to her children, Maggie then calls one of her relatives that were living in Honolulu and tells this relative what she had done to the children. Now, this relative, unfortunately, I do not know his or her name, But this relative then calls the Honolulu Police Department and tells them to go over to Maggie's house in Aiea to check up on Maggie and the children. Now, when the police arrive at the Young's residence, the police officer asks Maggie, quote, "What seems to be your trouble?" End quote. To which Maggie replies and says, quote, "I killed my children. I drowned them." End quote. Maggie doesn't deny that she killed her children at all. In fact, she automatically confesses to murdering her children. Maggie goes on to tell the police officer that she has become despondent because her children are often ill and she couldn't care for her children properly. However, Maggie would later tell her husband James that she believed her actions had been not only right, but necessary. You see, in Maggie's mind, she had removed the children from an evil and cruel world and had sent them to a far better place to be with God. Earlier that day, Mrs. Elaine Marshall, who is one of Maggie's older daughter's mother-in-law, said that Maggie had called her and was asking her if she knew what the penalties for crime was in Hawaii. Specifically, Maggie said, quote, "What's the penalty for murder in this state?" End quote. To which Mrs. Elaine Marshall then replied and said, quote, "Oh no, Maggie, what have you done?" End quote. Maggie replies and says, quote, "I killed them all. They were crying and I couldn't take care of them. They were sick and they were crying." End quote. Maggie is handcuffed and arrested and taken down to the station. Now, James, who was away on a flying mission, is notified immediately of what was going on and he hurries home. For some reason, Maggie is only charged with the drowning of her son, even though she openly admitted to killing all of the 5 children. Psychiatrists appointed to determine whether or not Maggie was sane found Maggie not fit to stand trial and said that Maggie was acting under a diseased and deranged condition. Instead of prison, Maggie was committed to the state hospital, which is located in Kaneohe on the island of Oahu. While in the state hospital, Administrator Audrey Mertz said that Maggie was beginning to respond to her treatment and she was beginning to group the enormity of what she had done to her children. On July 25th, 1966, about 6 months into her stay at the state hospital, this is when Maggie is starting to make some progress in her treatment. Now, on this day, Maggie was given a pass to walk alone by herself on the grounds. Unfortunately, Maggie would take this opportunity to get away, and not in the traditional sense of getting away or breaking out of the state hospital. With that pass to walk the state hospital grounds by herself, Maggie would make her way to a chicken slaughtering shed that was located in the hospital's farm area. It is here in this slaughtering shed that Maggie would end up taking her own life by hanging herself from the rafters. After this tragedy, you can only imagine the hurt and the deep, deep pain that James Young, Maggie's husband, was feeling. Now, he had lost his 5 children, and now he had lost his wife. James was a very devoted husband and a very devoted father. He stood by his wife the entire time, even after she murdered their 5 children. After Maggie killed herself, James couldn't stay in Hawaii, and he eventually moved to the mainland, and he eventually remarried, but he did not have any more children. James became an advocate for severe postpartum depression. James said that he has had to deal and cope the tragedy and the pain all his life. Holidays are extremely difficult, especially Thanksgiving and Christmas. Memories come flowing back as Christmas, is pretty much for the children. And he feels that Christmas has never been the same now that the children are gone. James said at first he blamed God, and then later he blamed himself. Over the years, James has really had to learn how to cope with the loss. He has gone through all the emotions and all the scenario. Really having to survive after losing your entire family. James has never stopped mourning the loss of his family, but he eventually managed to rebuild his life. These tragedies took place in the years 1965 and 1966. Now, about 35 years after this tragedy, James had learned about Andrea Yates and what she had done to her 5 children. Now, being that James had experienced and lived very, very similar situation, James made himself available to Andrea Yates' husband, Russell Yates. Now again, James is a very private person, but being that Russell Yates was pretty much living the nightmare that James experienced, James felt it in his heart that he needed to make himself available to Russell, offer whatever support he could. Andrea Yates had murdered her 5 children by drowning them in their bathtub. After learning about Andrea Yates, James said this, and I quote, "I don't mean to say that all parents who kill their kids are innocent by reason of insanity, but those suffering from severe postpartum depression do not need to be in jail. They need to be given treatment. Hopefully, the treatment will come before the tragedy," end quote. James and Maggie's 5 young children are all buried at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery in San Antonio, Texas. Alright guys, that's all I have for you on this case today. It pretty much wraps it up for me. I'm going to leave a few resources in the description box. If you or someone you know is suffering from postpartum depression, it doesn't even have to be severe postpartum depression, please feel free to reach out to any of the resources. Again, I'm going to leave it in the description box. Please know that you can reach out to a family member, a friend, your counselor, your therapist, your priest, your doctor. You can even message me and I will try and give you some support, point you in the right direction, and refer you to services. I'm interested to know your guys' thoughts about this case. Have you guys even heard about this case? Alright guys, I will see you guys in the next video. Bye! Bye!